They didn't just murder me. They methodically erased me. First came the heavy linen thread dipped in carbolic acid, piercing my eyelids to stitch the darkness shut forever. Then the surgeon's scalpel carved out my tongue so I could never utter Julian's name in court. Blind and mute, I died choking on my own blood. The scent of bitter almonds still lingered under my fingernails, a phantom trace of the potassium cyanide. Julian had dissolved into my evening Darjeeling tea on October 14, 2024. That was the day I officially signed away my 50% controlling stake in Miller Vane Logistics, transferring every remaining share of my family's empire to my husband, Julian Vane, and my dearest friend, Clara Hayes. I remembered the exact texture of the mahogany desk in our penthouse study at 742 Park Avenue, the chill of the fountain pen against my thumb. Julian's hand resting softly, too softly, on the small of my back, murmuring about our future in Monaco, while Clara poured the tea with hands that didn't shake nearly enough. They thought I was a compliant fool. They thought my loyalty to our 10-year marriage was a boundless well they could drain until I dropped. When the poison hit my stomach, it didn't feel like fire. It felt like a cold, spreading void. I collapsed against the Persian rug, clutching my abdomen as my vision blurred into sickly green rings. Julian didn't call an ambulance. He didn't even kneel. He simply stepped over my convulsing legs to retrieve his Mont Blanc Meisterstück pen from the floor, checking to ensure no ink had leaked onto the barrel. Clara stood by the window, sipping her tea, watching me thrash out my final breaths with the cold detachment of a botanist cataloguing a dying insect. "She always was too stubborn for her own good, Julian," Clara had whispered, her voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Better this way. The board meeting is tomorrow, and without her signature on the audit freeze, we would have been ruined." That was the last sentence I heard before my lungs seized. But death wasn't the end. It was an antechamber. I woke to the jarring, rhythmic chime of a Cartier Tank Française watch on the nightstand. The air smelled of rain and freshly pressed linen, the distinct scent of our bedroom at the Park Avenue penthouse, exactly as it had smelled 3 months before my murder. July 12th, 2024. 3 whole months gifted back to me by the universe, or perhaps by whatever malicious entity realized hell was already full. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, trapped bird. I sat up so fast my skull spun, throwing my hands to my face. My fingers brushed over soft, intact skin. No rough nylon thread. No swollen, puncture-scarred eyelids. I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, staring at the ceiling fan lazily rotating above. I could see every grain of the crown molding, every shadow cast by the street lamps outside through the sheer drapes. I threw off the duvet and padded across the hardwood floor to the ensuite bathroom. I gripped the marble double-sink vanity. So hard. My knuckles turned translucent, staring at my reflection in the fog-free mirror. The dark circles under my eyes were gone. The skin was smooth, untainted by the grey pallor of systemic poisoning. "You're back," I whispered to the glass. My voice sounded raspy, unused, but it worked. Tongue intact, vision pristine. A cold, methodical rage settled deep into my bones, freezing every erratic pulse into absolute, unyielding discipline. If the universe gave me a second chance, it wasn't for forgiveness or quiet healing. It was to become an executioner. In my past life, I had been an accountant, an auditor, who tracked hidden discrepancies, offshore shell corporations, and vanished assets. I knew how people hid their crimes. More importantly, I knew every single vulnerability Julian Vane and Clara Hayes possessed, because I was the one who had spent a decade building their respectable public facades from the ground up. Julian's voice drifted up from the hallway downstairs, smooth and syrupy, talking on his phone. "Yes, darling. The transfer is scheduled for October. Once the audit clears, we'll push her out. She suspects nothing. She's too busy managing the charity gala." A dark, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. "Darling." He was already rehearsing his lines with Clara. I turned away from the mirror and walked back into the bedroom. My laptop sat closed on the mahogany bureau. I opened it, plugged in my secure YubiKey, and bypassed the primary firewall straight into Julian's private encrypted server. It took 4 minutes to locate the hidden folder labeled Vane Holdings, Offshore. Inside were 52 documents detailing systematic embezzlement from our logistics company accounts, routed through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under Clara's maiden name. They weren't just planning to steal my company. They had been bleeding it dry for 2 years to fund their secret life and the lavish townhouse they had purchased together in Greenwich. My fingers flew across the keyboard, downloading every single file, every wire transfer receipt, every incriminating text message between Julian and Clara. I copied them onto an encrypted flash drive no larger than a stick of gum, slipped it into the pocket of my silk robe, and locked the bureau drawer. The game had changed. This time, I wouldn't sign anything in October. This time, I would let them weave their elaborate web of deceit, sinking deeper and deeper into their own arrogance, while I quietly pulled out every supporting pillar beneath them. 2 weeks passed in a delicate, agonizing waltz of deception. Every morning, I poured Julian's coffee with a steady, smiling hand, listening to him drone on about quarterly projections while mentally cataloguing every asset he thought he owned. Every evening, I endured Clara's breathless, superficial calls about venue arrangements for the upcoming charity auction, nodding along like the trusting, naive wife I had been in the first timeline. "You look radiant, Evelyn," Julian remarked over breakfast on a humid Tuesday morning in late July, sliding the morning Wall Street Journal across the Marble Island. "Stress-free. It's good for you, especially with the board vote coming up in August." "I've been sleeping better, Julian," I replied softly, meeting his amber-flecked hazel eyes without a flicker of hesitation. "I realize I've been carrying too much of the operational weight. Maybe it's time to delegate more responsibility to you and Clara." Julian's eyes flashed with a greedy, predatory glint that he tried to mask behind an affectionate chuckle. "Well, darling, you know I'm always here to share the burden. That's what partnership is about." Partnership. The word tasted like ash. That afternoon, with senior partner Raymond Vance at the Manhattan law firm of Vance and Sterling. Raymond was an old-school corporate litigator with a reputation for corporate restructuring and a personal loyalty to my late father, who had founded Miller Vane Logistics. In my first life, I had kept Raymond at arm's length to appease Julian, who constantly complained that Raymond was old-fashioned and obstructive. Raymond's office on the 42nd floor of the MetLife building smelled of aged leather, pipe tobacco, and impending legal reckoning. He adjusted his tortoise-shell glasses, looking over the printed summaries of the Cayman Island wire transfers I had placed on his cherrywood desk. "Evelyn," Raymond said, his voice dropping an octave as he lowered the paper, "do you realize what these documents represent? This isn't just breach of fiduciary duty. This is grand larceny, corporate tax evasion, and deliberate asset stripping. If these wire receipts are authentic, and my forensic team can verify them within 24 hours, your husband and Miss Hayes are looking at federal indictments." "They are authentic, Raymond," I said, my voice as cold and flat as a slab of winter marble. "And I don't want a public scandal just yet. I want a trap." Raymond leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with a mixture of professional awe and profound disquiet. "You've changed, Evelyn. 3 weeks ago, you wouldn't even let me audit the subsidiary accounts without consulting Julian." "People learn," I murmured, resting my hands neatly folded on my lap. "When you stare down the barrel of a gun, your priorities shift. Here is what we are going to do. Let Julian think he is winning. Let him push forward with the August board. Restructuring that grants him temporary executive oversight. Simultaneously, we will quietly freeze the secondary corporate accounts, using my sole executive veto power, diverting all liquid capital into a secure trust under my control." "And Clara?" Raymond asked, tapping his fountain pen against the blotter. "Clara thinks she's securing her future townhouse in Greenwich with embezzled funds," I said, a thin, sharp smile touching my lips. "Let her keep transferring the money. Every single illicit dollar she moves digs her grave a little deeper. When the time is right, we won't just file a civil suit. We will execute a simultaneous freeze across all personal and corporate assets, locking them out of their bank accounts, their credit cards, and their precious townhouses on the exact same morning Julian thinks he's seizing total control of Miller Vane." Raymond let out a low, gravelly whistle, a rare sign of admiration. "It's a complete economic execution. Crucial detail. Once we pull the trigger, there is no turning back. They will be legally and financially annihilated." "Good," I whispered, standing up and smoothing down the lapels of my tailored Armani blazer. That was always the intention. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched Julian and Clara play their pathetic little roles with agonizing precision. Julian began meeting with the board members behind my back, offering them backroom concessions and empty promises of inflated dividends once he ousted me as CEO. He started leaving his phone face down on the nightstand, thinking I was too blind to notice the late-night notifications from Clara flashing across the OLED screen. "Everything is falling into place. Just a few more weeks, my love." Every time I saw those texts, a cold spike of adrenaline shot through my veins, fueling the fire. They were so busy building their paradise on my ruins that they never noticed the structural cracks I was carving into their foundation. On August 18th, 2024, Julian popped a bottle of Dom Perignon in our penthouse living room to celebrate what he believed was his impending corporate coup. He handed me a crystal flute, his eyes gleaming with triumphant malice barely disguised as champagne-fueled affection. "To the future, Evelyn," Julian toasted, clinking his glass against mine with a ring that clicked sharply in the silent room. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings, Julian," I repeated, holding his gaze steadily, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the bubbling golden liquid, while inside I counted down the hours until dawn. Part 1 continued seamlessly from the introductory moments of betrayal. Clara's laughter chimed like crystal glassware shattering against tile. She adjusted the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a gift Julian had purchased using corporate funds, while I was busy finalizing the Q2 philanthropic endowment. Evelyn always was so painfully predictable, Clara sneered, leaning against the marble kitchen island. She actually believed you loved her, Julian. She thought those weekends you spent inspecting the regional warehouses were about logistics. She never once checked the mileage on the company sedan. Julian chuckled, a low, guttural sound of supreme arrogance. He walked over to Clara, sliding his hands around her waist and pulling her close for a deliberate, taunting kiss right in my line of sight, or what he assumed was my final, fading field of vision. She was used when her father was alive, Julian murmured against Clara's lips. Miller Vane Logistics needed her family name to secure the municipal contracts. But now, her name is just dead weight on the letterhead. Once the signature is notarized tomorrow morning, we liquidate her personal accounts, transfer the remaining liquid capital to the Cayman shell, and file for her institutionalization. The psychiatric evaluation is already signed by Dr. Harrison. Dr. Harrison, a man I had funded through medical school, whose family clinic I had bailed out of bankruptcy 3 separate times. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back. It was a systematic flaying, executed by every single person I had ever fed, housed, or protected. My spirit thrashed against the encroaching darkness, screaming curses they couldn't hear. The private dining room at the Grill on East 52nd Street smelled of roasted truffles, old money, and bitter betrayal. It was September 15th, 2024, exactly 1 month before the scheduled execution date from my past life. Julian sat at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by 3 regional directors of Miller Vane Logistics and Clara Hayes, who had appointed herself corporate liaison, despite holding no official executive title. Clara was draped in a custom Oscar de la Renta ivory gown, her fingers adorned with diamond rings that shimmered under the warm amber sconces. I walked in 10 minutes late, deliberately pacing my entrance so all eyes turned toward me. I wore a tailored, double-breasted charcoal pantsuit from Tom Ford, sharp, militaristic, and entirely devoid of the decorative frivolity Julian preferred. "Evelyn, darling, you're just in time," Julian purred, standing up to pull out my chair with theatrical chivalry. His hazel eyes scanned my suit with a momentary flash of irritation before he pasted back on his warm, corporate smile. "We were just discussing the Q3 expansion into the European shipping lanes. I told the board you were fully on board with transferring operational control to the executive committee next month." I didn't sit down immediately. I stood behind the chair, resting both palms flat against the polished mahogany surface, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the table. The regional directors, men who had groveled at my father's feet a decade ago, squirmed under my silence, suddenly finding deep fascination in their water goblets. "Operational control, Julian?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, crystalline resonance that cut right through the ambient jazz music playing overhead. Strange. I don't recall signing a transfer mandate. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of panic that only someone who had watched him murder her could possibly catch. He recovered quickly, letting out a smooth, patronizing chuckle. "Now, Evelyn, don't play the executive in front of our guests. We discussed this last night over champagne. You agreed that the administrative burden was becoming too much for your health." "My health is exceptionally robust, Julian," I replied. Stepping around the chair and taking my seat, I opened my leather attaché case, withdrew a thick manila folder, and dropped it onto the table with a sharp, definitive thud. In fact, I've never been more clear-headed, which is why this morning my legal team at Vance and Sterling filed an emergency injunction freezing all secondary corporate accounts, subsidiary asset transfers, and offshore routing numbers associated with Miller Vein Logistics. The room went dead silent. The jazz music seemed to fade into nothingness. Clara dropped her silver fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain dessert plate, splashing a drop of red wine onto the white tablecloth. "What did you say?" Clara gasped, her voice pitching an octave higher than intended. Julian's face drained of color, his skin turning the pale, sickly gray of skim milk. Beads of sweat instantly materialized along his hairline, catching the warm sconce light. "Evelyn, what kind of sick joke is this? Have you been drinking?" "Look at page 4, Julian," I said, sliding a printed audit report across the mahogany table toward him. "That's the exact wire transfer receipt from August 14th, routing $4.2 million from our primary logistics account into a Cayman shell company, registered under Clara Hayes's maiden name, complete with her signature, and your digital authorization stamp." Julian's hands shook visibly as he reached for the paper. His fingers fumbled against the edge of the document, rustling the sheets with a frantic, stammering desperation. This is forged. This is an internal conspiracy. Raymond Vance is senile. He's trying to sabotage the board restructure. Raymond Vance is 82 years old and has a mind sharper than a surgeon's scalpel, I interrupted, leaning forward, resting my chin on my interlocked fingers. And he didn't forge anything, Julian. The federal prosecutors at the Southern District of New York already have the digital mirrors of your personal laptop hard drive. They executed a search warrant on your Greenwich townhouse 30 minutes ago. Clara stood up so fast, her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. Her carefully constructed composure shattered completely, her makeup looking suddenly heavy and clownish over her sweating skin. "You bitch!" she screamed, lunging across the table toward me, with her manicured nails bared like claws. "You set us up! You calculated whom—" Before she could take 2 steps, 2 plainclothes federal agents stepped out from the private dining room service alcove, their badges flashing coldly under the lights. Raymond Vance walked in right behind them, his tailored trench coat draped over his arm, looking like an angel of death in a bespoke suit. "Miss Hayes," the lead federal agent stated, his voice flat and absolute as he gripped Clara's upper arm, spinning her around and clicking stainless steel handcuffs around her wrists with a crisp, metallic snap. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Clara let out a raw, animalistic shriek of pure terror, thrashing against the agent's grip as her expensive Oscar de la Renta gown tangled around her ankles. "Julian, do something! Tell them, Julian, fix this!" Julian remained frozen in his chair, his jaw hanging open, staring at the handcuffs with eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogance that had defined him for a decade had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, sweating coward who couldn't even manage a coherent syllable. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the lapels of my Tom Ford pantsuit. I walked around the table until I was standing directly beside Julian's chair. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his mouth working wordlessly, like a fish hauled up onto a dry dock. "Evelyn, please," Julian whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, whimpering sob as he reached out a trembling hand to grab the hem of my trousers. "We were husband and wife. 10 years. Think of our home, our life. I stepped back, avoiding his desperate fingers as if he carried a contagious disease. I looked down at him with eyes as cold and empty as an operating theatre. In my past life, Julian, I whispered softly, leaning down so only he could hear the venom in my breath. You stitched my eyes shut and watched me choke on poison. Julian's eyes dilated to the size of saucers, his face turning an ash grey as the words registered in his fractured mind. He let out a choked, terrified gasp, staggering backward out of his chair and collapsing hard onto the restaurant floor. How do you? He stammered, scrambling away from me like a cornered rat. Welcome to the dark, Julian, I said, turning my back on him as the federal agents hauled him up by his elbows. You're going to find out that without your lies, you're nothing at all. The final reckoning did not take place in a courtroom. It took place on a cold, rainy November afternoon inside the holding facility of the federal courthouse downtown. Julian sat across from me, behind a thick partition of reinforced safety glass, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his shrunken, trembling frame. The arrogant golden boy CEO of Miller Vein Logistics was gone. In his place sat a hollowed-out husk of a man with sunken cheeks, greasy unwashed hair, and eyes bruised by weeks of absolute insomnia. He stared through the glass at me, like a ghost had risen from an open grave. The plea deal was rejected, Julian, I said into the steel mesh intercom speaker. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of emotion. Judge Miller sentenced you to 25 years without the possibility of parole. Clara took a plea, but her cooperation bought her 20 years in a federal penitentiary upstate. Your Greenwich townhouse was seized by the Asset Forfeiture Unit last week. Even your mother's estate was impounded to cover back taxes on your shell companies. Julian's lips trembled violently. He pressed his palms flat against the glass on his side, leaving damp, pathetic smears against the pane. Evelyn, please, just 5 minutes. Let me talk to you. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm so sorry. You don't know what sorry is, Julian, I interrupted, my expression remaining perfectly impassive. You were sorry your plan failed. You were sorry the federal agents caught you before you could board a private flight to Zurich. You weren't sorry when you poured potassium cyanide into my tea. You weren't sorry when you stepped over my convulsing body on the Persian rug. Julian let out a guttural, broken sob, sliding down the glass until he was slumped against the concrete floor of his booth, his face buried in his handcuffed hands. The sound of his weeping was small, pathetic, and entirely drowned out by the hum of the facility's fluorescent lights. I stood up, adjusting the collar of my wool coat, and turned away from the glass partition. I walked out of the federal building and stepped out onto the wide stone steps facing Foley Square. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the bruised, steel-grey canopy of the Manhattan sky. A sharp autumn wind whipped past my face, carrying the scent of wet pavement and roasted chestnuts from a corner cart. My vision was clear. My tongue was my own. Every share of my father's empire was back where it belonged, fully restored under my exclusive, unchallengeable control. Miller Vein Logistics was thriving, its corrupt branches pruned away to reveal a healthy, invincible trunk. I took a deep, lung-filling breath of the crisp air, feeling the absolute, intoxicating weight of freedom settle deep into my bones. The past life was a nightmare I had survived. This life was a kingdom I had built from the ashes of my enemies. I opened my umbrella, descended the stone steps with steady, unhesitating strides, and walked out into the open city, ready for whatever tomorrow demanded. Part 1. Continued seamlessly from the cold resolve inside the walk-in closet. The digital clock glowed 6:18 a.m. Every second counted. I needed to move before Julian finished his morning workout on the basement level and came upstairs expecting his usual fawning domesticity. I slipped the heavy steel-barreled Glock 19 into my leather attaché case alongside the original share certificates, clicking the brass latches shut with a crisp, reassuring sound. I unlocked the bedroom door and walked down the sweeping curved staircase of the penthouse. The marble steps were ice-cold beneath my stocking feet, echoing the clinical detachment that now governed every heartbeat in my chest. From the home gym down the hall, the rhythmic thud of a treadmill motor hummed through the walls. Julian was running his daily 5 miles, sweating over his tablet, projecting a facade of disciplined health while his soul rotted in moral bankruptcy. I walked past the open doorway without slowing down, catching a fleeting glimpse of his reflection in the mirrored wall, his shoulders pumping, his face twisted in a look of intense, self-satisfied ambition. He had no idea that the woman he planned to murder in 90 days was already auditing his grave. I entered the expansive gourmet kitchen, its stainless steel surfaces gleaming under recessed LED lighting. In my past life, this was where I used to brew his artisanal Kenyan coffee every morning while listening to him complain about market volatility. Today, I walked straight to the high-end espresso machine, pulled out the water reservoir, and emptied it down the drain. Then, I opened the pantry and located the custom tin of organic Darjeeling tea leaves that Clara had casually gifted us 2 weeks prior, the exact brand and batch from which the lethal dose of potassium cyanide would eventually be drawn in October. I unscrewed the lid, lifted the seal, and took a cautious sniff. Even now, buried under the fragrant aroma of dried black tea leaves, a faint metallic undertone of bitter almonds whispered from the bottom of the tin. They hadn't just planned my murder for October. The poison was already sitting in our pantry, purchased and paid for with a corporate credit card back in June. Using a pair of sterile kitchen tongs, I lifted a pinch of the suspicious leaves, dropped them into a glass specimen vial I had retrieved from my emergency medical kit, and sealed the cap tight. Proof. Chemical evidence sitting right in our own kitchen, waiting to be analyzed by an independent forensic lab. Evelyn? Julian's voice cut through the quiet hum of the refrigerator, making me freeze for a microsecond before I smoothly turned around. He stood in the kitchen doorway, draped in a grey Nike athletic hoodie, a white towel slung around his damp neck. His hazel eyes scanned the kitchen with a fleeting, suspicious narrowing, before his expression melted back into affectionate concern. "Up early, darling," Julian noted, stepping closer and reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers were slick with post-workout sweat, smelling faintly of citrus body wash. "You look intense this morning. Everything all right with the charity gala preparations?" I didn't flinch away from his touch, though every nerve ending in my skin screamed at the contamination of his hand. I looked straight into his eyes, maintaining a steady, placid smile that completely masked the lethal current running underneath. "Just reviewing the logistical budgets, Julian," I replied smoothly, my voice as calm as a deep lake. "I realized we've been letting administrative costs slip through the cracks, Maybe it's time for a thorough, top-to-bottom internal audit of every subsidiary account before the third quarter board meeting. A slow, profound sense of release washed over me. The trap was sprung. There was no escape hatch, no offshore lifeline, and no sympathetic board member who could bail them out now. "Drive to Miller Coal Logistics, David," I instructed our longtime family chauffeur, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon picking up a scalpel. As the car pulled up to the soaring glass and steel monolith of our corporate headquarters, I looked up at the towering logo etched into the facade. Coal Logistics. By sunset, that name would be legally stripped of the man who had tried to murder me, returning entirely to my father's legacy. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing down the front of my charcoal wool coat, and walked through the revolving glass doors with my head held high, ready to watch their magnificent empire turn to dust.